Welcome to the Commandant Speaker Series. Today's topic is on building cohesive and resilient teams based on mutual trust. In very simple terms, we're talking about teamwork and teams. And in a series of books written over a period of the last 10 years, our speaker has a great deal of insights on this topic. My name is Colonel Pat Howell. I'll be moderating today's discussion. After some quick introductions, I'll be doing some directed question and answers with our speaker for about 30 or so minutes. At that point, we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. Please type your questions into the live chat box. Our featured guest is Simon Sinek. Simon is an unshakable optimist. He believes in a bright future and the ability to build it together. Described as a visionary thinker with a rare intellect, Simon has devoted his professional life to help advance a vision of the world that does not yet exist. A world in which the vast majority of people wake up every single morning inspired, feel safe wherever they are, and at the end of the day, fulfilled by the work they do. Simon is the author of multiple best-selling books, including Start With Why, Leaders Eat First, and The Infinite Game. Simon, let me tell you about our audience briefly. On the other side of the computer, we have about 1,000 members of the class of 2021. They are wrapping up their 7th of 8 semesters before they graduate in May and head out to lead America's sons and daughters in the profession of arms. Most of them will be leading groups of 20 to 40 soldiers in the ages of 18 to 35, mid-30s, between 12 and 18 months from now. Now, before the first question, could you give us a quick background of how you got into the business of studying people and organizations, and then relate that to why should we study why first as opposed to studying how or what? And how does studying why make a better organization?
I got into this profession by accident. It started many years ago when I lost my passion for my own work. And people gave me stupid advice like, follow your passion, find your bliss. I'm like, thank you. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? I mean, it's true, but it's totally unactionable. And it was sort of a hard time because superficially, everything looked good. At the time, I owned my own small business. We had good clients. We did good work, but I didn't want to do it every day. I didn't want to do it anymore. And so I was embarrassed, quite frankly. And so all of my energy went into pretending that I was happier, more in control, and more successful than I felt. And let me tell you, when you show up every day lying, hiding, and faking, it's exhausting. And it wasn't until a very close friend of mine said, I'm worried about you, something's different, something's wrong, did I come clean. And that cathartic experience released this energy so that I could point all of that energy away from lying, hiding, and faking into finding a solution. And the solution that I found was this thing called the why. And I started to recognize patterns that all of the great leaders, whether business leaders or social leaders, military leaders, that every single one of them, they all thought, acted, and communicated the exact same way. And it was the complete opposite from everybody else. Where everybody else started by telling you what they did and how they were different, these great leaders started telling you why they do what they do, and then took it from there. And so, my career was an accident. People just kept asking me to talk about this thing, and I just kept saying yes. And then I had opportunities to give TED Talks and write books, etc. But I do, as you said at the beginning, I have this belief that every single one of us has the right to wake up in the morning inspired, feel safe wherever we are, and end the day fulfilled by the work that we do. And I believe leaders are the best bet that we've got to build that world. So the question you asked is sort of why does why come first? Well, it's actually, interestingly, not my opinion. It's actually based on the biology of human decision making. It's grounded in biology. The part of the brain that controls our behavior, our limbic brain, responds to that question, why? Whereas the rational part of our brain that may be responsible for language, but is not responsible for human behavior, and it's not responsible for how we feel, that's sort of at the what level, sort of the stuff we do. All the rational, tangible, countable things. And so when people make an argument based on rational stuff, unfortunately, it doesn't inspire action. Only when we feel connected, emotionally connected to something, are we willing to sacrifice and go beyond for some higher calling.
Okay, thank you. Let's say we have a leader, a young leader who has a why in mind, but let's assume that just having a why doesn't make the organization. You just can't say I've got a why, therefore we got a great organization. So from your research, what are some of the most organizationally effective teams that you found, and did they magically come into place, or how did they come around?
Well, I think it was Thomas Edison who said, vision without execution is hallucination. It's the same thing. I don't believe that why is more important than how or what. And just to be clear, what those three things mean, what are the tangible physical things that we do? It's the products we make, the services we offer. How are the manner in which we do things? These are where our values live. And our why is some purpose, cause, or belief. It's something underlying that inspires us to get out of bed every day. So yes, I don't believe the why is more important than the other levels. All three are important. You have to have all three, but so often the why is forgotten, which is why I've spent so much time talking about it. But yeah, if all you do is have cause and no execution, you live on a hippie commune. It's all kumbaya and you don't get anything done. So yeah, you got to have all three pieces. But the point of the why is it provides context. It provides context for why we do what we do. And the more personal it can be, the more compelling it is. And this in the profession of arms, few if any soldiers run into battle for God or country. It's guy to the left and guy to the right. I mean, that's what it is. It's person to the left and person to the right. It's deeply personal and deeply human, which is why relationships matter so much, which is why trust matters so much, which is why the intangibles matter so much, which is why one of the primary responsibilities of any leader is to create a dynamic in which the team comes together, in which the team gels and can trust each other. Because it's that trust that makes them compelling in a combat or chaotic situation. It's not some esoteric we're doing this for God and country, because that's not what makes a sacrifice. It's those human dynamics that makes a sacrifice.
So what are actions that if a leader wants to create this trust, and I believe you've used the term circle of trust or circle of safety. I apologize if I've got them wrong. What are things that a leader can do to create this circle of safety? I mean, it sounds easy, make trust. All right, so what are some tangible things to do this?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a story. I've had the opportunity to visit OCS at Quantico, and the colonel in charge was about to give me a briefing, and he showed up late, which, these things don't happen. He walked in late and apologized. He said, we've had an incident serious enough that we're considering throwing one of our cadets, one of our Marine candidates, out of the Marine Corps. And I'm thinking, what did this guy do? Like, what law did he break? So I said, what did he do? And the colonel said, he fell asleep on watch. And I was like, that's it? Like, he fell asleep on watch in the woods of Virginia, and you're going to throw him out of the Marine Corps for that? And the colonel said, you have to understand, when we asked him about it, he denied it. And when we asked him about it again, he denied it again. And only when we gave him irrefutable proof did he say, quote, I want to take responsibility for my actions. And the problem we have is you don't take responsibility for your actions at the time you get caught. You take responsibility for your actions at the time you perform your actions. He said, we had another Marine who fell asleep on watch. He owned up to it immediately. He got punished, and we have no problem with him. And then he went on to explain, he says, you have to understand, if we put this kid in a leadership position, and at any point, those in his command believe that he would hide the truth to protect his own ass, or if he would do anything to advance himself and not his team, trust will break and people will die. And so one of the things that creates a circle of safety is integrity. That if, as a leader, we screw up, we say, I screwed up. And what that does is it creates conditions in which other people in our command, if they screw up, they will tell us, and then we can help them fix the problem. But if we hide and we lie and we fake, then we create conditions in which all our people lie, hide, and fake. If we only catch people doing things wrong, then they'll take the minimum amount of risk and hide anything that goes wrong. If we catch people doing things right, they'll take pride in their work. A lot of these things are actually very, very simple in concept, but hard to implement. Think of it like any interpersonal relationship, friendship. When we screw up, it's hard to tell our friends we screwed up. When we get yelled at, it's hard to immediately own up to it. We say stupid things like, I'm sorry you feel that way. Like, you can't feel sorry for my feelings. You can only feel sorry. You can only be sorry for your own actions. That made me feel this way, for example. And so the funny thing is the practices of good leadership very often are the practices of being a good human being.
Okay. So let me ask this: for this practice, if I'm trying to create trust with my organization, is an effective way? Should I contact the members of my unit and say, hey, I want I value, you're a member of my team. What can I do to make the team better? What are the things, concrete things I could do to create trust? I mean, I'm saying it right then. Is that good?
There are multiple things. They have to be in earnest. I can give you the checklist and someone can go through the checklist, but if it's not in earnest, it doesn't work. People want to feel seen and people want to feel heard. And feedback is essential. Learning how to give and receive feedback is absolutely essential. And though we can get feedback, it doesn't mean we have to do what everybody says, but it's important that people feel like they contributed. I'll give you a simple example. It goes back to a story of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is a very important case study in leadership because he is universally regarded as a great leader. Different personalities go around the world are viewed very differently, but Mandela is universally regarded as a great leader, which is why it's important. And he was asked once by a journalist, how did you learn to become such a great leader? And what a lot of people didn't know is that he's actually the son of a tribal chief. He grew up the son of a tribal chief when he was a kid. And he went on to explain how when he was a boy, he remembered going to tribal meetings with his father. And he remembers two things. One, they always sat in a circle. And two, his father was always the last to speak. And if you think what that does to a room, it treats everybody like their opinions matter, but also being the last to speak allows for people to feel like they have a say. And interestingly, it allows for that leader to take in more information, even though their opinion might be the same. And if you think how we operate so often, we call a meeting, the senior person in the room says, here's the problem, here's what I think we should do, and I'm interested in what you all have to say. Well, it's too late now. You've muddied the waters, because either everybody's going to agree with you or they feel that their opinions don't matter. It's a big deal for a leader to come into the room and say, here's the problem we face, and I want to know what you think, and take the feedback. Again, it doesn't mean you have to change your opinion, but you'll actually get more perspective, and more important, the people in your charge feel like their points of view and their opinions matter, which means they'll contribute more in the future. Listening is one of those skills that I think a lot of leaders, quite frankly, could do a lot better learning. And listening doesn't mean hearing the words that are spoken. Listening means trying to ascertain the meaning of those words or the motivation for those words. And listening also means that the other person feels heard. And listening is a very difficult skill, but it is a practicable, learnable skill. One of the things that I think is so interesting in your profession as well, which is, and I think the general population has a great misperception of military life. They think it's all just command and control, which it's not. But of course, there are times for command and control. In the situation of combat or chaos, we need someone who can take charge and does actually bark orders. But the question is how do those people feel who are on the receiving end of the orders? And it's the months and months and months and months back at home station, back in peacetime, back in the United States, where all that trust is built over time, so that when we are in a position where we are issued commands that we will have to follow blindly, we do so with the absolute confidence that commander would never issue an order that they didn't believe, they would never send us into harm's way, that they didn't believe was the absolute right thing to do, even if they make mistakes. And I think people forget that it's not one or, it's one and. Trust is built at home so that when we have to bark commands and expect blind loyalty, that trust already exists. It doesn't just happen overnight like that.
As you were talking, something you said gave me a flashback to a talk of yours that I was watching recently, and I thought it'd be interesting. And it was a great story of how a case study of compare and contrast of how one organization could build trust or make the team bigger, and another one didn't. And this is the story of the barista at the Four Seasons at Las Vegas versus somewhere else. So it's you have a great experiment. You have a compare and contrast.
Yeah, it was one of those rare opportunities that in my field was magic. It's like I discovered a pot of gold. Yeah, I mean, I was on a business trip in Vegas, and they put me up at the Four Seasons out there, which is fantastic and beautiful and wonderful. The reason the Four Seasons is great is not just because of the fancy beds. Any hotel can buy a fancy bed. It's because of the people who work there. that when you roam the halls and somebody says hello, you get the distinct feeling that they wanted to say hello, not that they were told to say hello. You know, we're highly tuned to social animals. We can tell the difference. It's like you can tell when someone is working on commission, and like you can feel it, you know? Salesperson's working on commission. Anyway, they happened to have a coffee bar in the lobby out there. And one afternoon I went and bought a cup of coffee, and the barista working that day was a kid named Noah. Noah was funny and engaging and charming, and I spent far too long standing there buying my cup of coffee because I just enjoyed talking to Noah. And so I asked him, you know, do you like your job? And without skipping a beat, he said, I love my job. Now, that's significant. Like is rational. I like the people, I like the challenge, I like my job. Love is emotional, right? It's like, do you love your wife? I like her a lot, right? It's a different standard. Noah said, I love my job. So of course my ears perked up. This kid has an emotional connection to his work. So I immediately followed up and said, can you tell me specifically what the Four Seasons is doing that you would say to me, you love your job? And again, he gave no thought. He said, immediately, he said, throughout the day, managers will walk past me and ask me how I'm doing, ask me if there's anything I need to do my job better, not just my manager, any manager. And then he said, I also work at a different hotel. And there, the leaders walk past me and catch me when I'm doing something wrong only. He says, all they do is drive performance. There, I like to keep my head below the radar, just make it through the end of the day and collect my paycheck. He said, only at the Four Seasons do I feel I can be myself. Now, if you think about that for a second, this is the exact same human being. And yet my experience of him at the two different hotels would be profoundly different, not because of him, but because of the leadership environment in which he's working. And so often when we have performance issues as a team, you know, we think it's always our people. Rarely do we look at the leadership environment that those people have to work in. And in this particular case, you know, and I get this question all the time, you know, how do we get the most out of our people? You know, people are not a towel, you don't wring them out. That's not how it works. It's a flawed question. The question is, how do we create an environment in which our people can work at their natural best? And the Four Seasons was doing that in spades.
Are there any other, this is a great example of the managers, the leadership of the Four Seasons taking interest in their subordinate. Are there any other traits that you've observed from your research that really also help promote or get the reaction that you just saw with Noah? Are there other things that leaders do that can draw that reaction?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, leaders have to understand what their responsibility is. You know, leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in our charge. You know, and when I talk about officers eat last or leaders eat last, you know, it's a funny thing that shows up in the military, where we feed those in our charge before we feed ourselves, just like we feed our children before we feed ourselves. It's a simple expression of care, is what it is. And even though, based on the virtue of their rank, you know, the leaders could eat first and no one would question it. I mean, they have rank, they get certain perks and opportunities, they get better parking spaces, right? They get nicer offices. We know that rank affords perks, and eating first is one of those perks, except when we see a leader give up that perk in order to look after their people, it sends a communication. And so I think first and foremost, leaders have to understand that their responsibility is the lives of other human beings. Middle management is the hardest thing of all, because when you're rank and file on the front line, your job is to do a good job, you know. And when you're senior leadership, you know, your job is to oversee the organization and have more of that sort of infinite mindset. But it's this middle rank, it's that middle management job that's so hard because you're sort of managing both. And I think for those who understand that the job is not simply to do a good job and to get our people to do good jobs and to do a good job ourselves and look fancy and look good and be eligible for promotion, our job is to take care of our people and see that they rise. That is what leadership is. It's not rank. Rank affords you authority, but leadership is the responsibility to see those around us rise. And it involves things like empathy and care and patience and all of these parenting things, discipline when necessary, but always done with love.
Okay. As I said before, this class that you're talking with right now, in 12 to 18 months, they're going to be leading groups of 20 to 40 soldiers. And a majority of those soldiers will probably be less than 20, 25, 26, and a good number of those will probably be 18 to 22-year-olds. Now, the class of 21, when they get out there, they're going to be between 24 and 25, 22 and 24-year-old themselves, but they'll be the first to admit this 47-month West Point experience is a little bit out of the ordinary. So from your research, do you have any insights for these future leaders on dealing with this demographic that they're about to come back into? That they've been separated for, we separated them out for 47 months. Now they're about to join again. What insights do you have on this demographic?
So, every generation has different experiences when they come of age. And much is said of this generation and some of the things that, older generations complain about them. Every generation complains about, older generation complains about younger generations, but there's some truth. There are some generalities that we can make, and it's totally fine to make generalities about entire generations. By the way, it doesn't mean everybody's that way, but there are generalizations. So, for example, many of our grandparents who lived through the Great Depression or the Second World War, for the rest of their lives, were really frugal and miserly. They saved every jam jar and reused every piece of aluminum foil, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with them. It's because they came of age in a time that informed their worldview. The boomer generation came of age during Vietnam and Richard Nixon, and so grew up to be really cynical of sort of authority and leadership positions. And so this generation grew up in a post-September 11th world where cell phones and social media were ubiquitous in their lives, and this affects their worldview. There's some huge advantages that this young generation has. They're very open-minded. They don't care where you're from. They don't care what the color of your skin is, or your gender identity, or your sexuality. It's all good, Older generations struggle with those things. Older generations don't understand that there's actually a difference between gender identity and sexuality. This younger generation knows that. They understand personal branding, things like that. But there are some liabilities as well. So much cell phone and so much social media. Many young people have actually missed out on how to form deep meaning for personal relationships. And I've had so many conversations with college kids, for example, who will say very openly that they get along with their friends, they have fun with their friends, but they wouldn't necessarily trust their friends if they were in trouble, or they wouldn't be surprised if their friends canceled on them because they got better plans. And they struggle, these are their words, not mine, they struggle to form deep, meaningful relationships. And so I think one of the things that I hope that West Point provides is to teach a generation how to form these deep, meaningful relationships, what skills that requires, so that these young leaders can take those skills to those who may struggle with the same things.
This next one's actually a fairly short question. Again, from one of your talks, could you give your answer to a younger generation that says that we're just very good at multitasking, and then explain why you disagree with them?
Well, it's just factually incorrect. First of all, there's no such thing as multitasking. You can do one thing great, two things okay, three things not so good, and anything more than that, it starts to collapse. And you just ask any professor who's ever read a paper written by a student who claims they're so good at multitasking, the first paragraph is great, the second paragraph might be well written, the third paragraph might be also very well, except the first, second, and third paragraph have nothing to do with each other. It's because it's right, stop, right, stop, right, stop. And we know there's tons of research on how the human brain works, that it takes about 20 minutes for us to get into deep concentration. And every interruption we get, that clock restarts. So deep thinking doesn't start for 20 minutes before you quote unquote get in the zone. I mean, if I were to play a little game with you, what if you were doing work and I randomly was allowed to ring a bell, and every time I rang the bell, you had to get up and go to the fridge, right? And I could ring the bell whenever I wanted while you were trying to do work, and you had to go up and go to the fridge every time I rang the bell. Well, how good is the quality of that work? It's so obvious, right? Well, what do you think the difference is when your phone goes buzz or beep, you get a notification on the computer when you're in the middle of work and you stop for a second and just reply? It's the exact same thing. And if it's obvious in one circumstance, it should be obvious in the second circumstance. And the young generation that claims they're good at multitasking, they would defy 100,000 years of biology. And it's it's a feeling that they have, but the quality of the work on the receiving end suffers. It's just not true.
Let's say you've been able to build a great team by creating the circle of trust, circle of safety, or you're fortunate if you came into one that was already a high functioning organization. But how can good units and people sometimes start doing bad things? And I'm really thinking about what we were talking about before with our discussion with about Lenny Wong and the concept that you got from him.
Yeah, so there's a concept in psychology called ethical fading that one of your own, Dr. Lenny Wong, a retired colonel, I learned it from him. And ethical fading is a condition in which people make unethical decisions believing they're well within their own ethical framework. In other words, I haven't done anything wrong. In the extreme, it looks like when a pharmaceutical company, for example, raises the price of an essential drug 500, 800, 1,000%. It's not illegal, but it's highly unethical. We saw it happen in the extreme at Wells Fargo Bank, where thousands of employees opened millions of fake bank accounts because they had targets that they had to hit. And we say things like, how do you sleep at night? They sleep just fine because they don't think they've done anything wrong. There are multiple conditions, all of which are elements of self-deception that create the conditions for ethical fading. One of them is sort of this sort of rationalizing, this chain of logic. Things like everyone's doing it, or I'm just trying to please my boss, or it's what they want, or it's the system, or I had no choice, or I have to put food on the table to justify our decisions. In other words, we're distancing ourselves from responsibility because it's someone else or something else that is responsible for making me do this. This happened, the overuse of euphemisms, for example. In the military, I mean, we one that was popular a few years ago. We talked about enhanced interrogation, because in America we don't torture, that would violate our values, but enhanced interrogation is really appealing. Like we overused euphemisms again to create distance from our actions. And Dr. Wong discovered this in the Army. He discovered rampant lying amongst the officers, and yet the officers believed that they held themselves to a higher ethical standard, higher levels of integrity than the general population. And yet, when confronted with these lies, they were able to rationalize them away. For example, there was some required online training before a group would have to deploy, and so instead of all of the soldiers doing the training, they would have the smartest guy in the room take all the CAT cards and just repeat the class 9 times and give everybody their certificate. And when asked about it, they would say, "Yeah, but it wasn't that important," or "We're just fulfilling the bureaucracy." But the reality is they lied. Or worse, the Army had set up, unfortunately, the Army had set up conditions that created a conflict of integrity. There were more training requirements in the schedule than there were training days available. So what do? Well, being as officers are expected to look like they can handle everything and get everything done because it makes them promotable, they would lie. They would say they completed things that they didn't complete, because to tell the truth, to say I couldn't get it done, I didn't do it, actually made you unpromotable. It made you less desirable. And so this conflict was created where you were rewarded for lying and punished for telling the truth. And so you see, so these are funny things that happen that create conditions for ethical fading. And one of the ways to beat ethical fading is honesty. Quite frankly, is for first of all, leadership should require honesty, and the incentive structures should be to promote telling the truth and not accidentally promote the lying, which happens accidentally. And having a sense of purpose and cause, quite frankly, like we're not just doing this for ourselves, we're doing this for a higher calling, that we want to leave this organization in better shape than we found it. The quality of trust in the team, we've talked about trusting teams multiple times, also helps avoid ethical fading, because it allows somebody to feel safe to say, this seems wrong, without getting bashed for speaking the truth, but for somebody to say, you're right, or this is not the way we act. And everybody goes, you're right. So the quality of trust on a team is also, it helps avoid ethical fading.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch over to the questions that are being put forth by the cadets. We already have a whole slew stacked up. So the first question comes from Joshua Bowen, and he asks, Mr. Sinek, recognizing the need for an infinite game mindset and to build or maintain safety within the team, how can direct line leaders best hold their people or even their peers accountable for performance and team standards?
Such a great question. So first of all, clear communication is always king, right? People want to know what the standards are, and we want to make sure that our incentive structures, our reward structures, our recognition structures are consistent. It's very often that we say one standard and then leaders surprise people. That's number one. How we give feedback also matters. I talked to a young airman. She was given her first command downrange, and she took over a job down there where every previous young leader who had taken over that job was fired. So she was the fifth in line of this sort of mess of a group. And she was an airman who would oversee soldiers and airmen, many of them much older than her. And she came in with a big ego and like, I'm going to put it right. I'm a high performer. You know, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to be a great leader. I've studied leadership and all of that stuff. And it went horribly sideways for her. And she recognized that one of the ways that she gave feedback is when something went wrong, she would give feedback in the moment. And so she would upset whatever rhythm they were in that moment. And she learned to save it all up. Let the thing go as it goes, and at the end of the day, when they debrief, to stand and say, okay, guys, here's some of the things that I think we can improve. And people were much more in a better mindset to receive that information. But holding people accountable also means holding ourselves accountable. You know, if we screw up, we have to say, on me, my bad. And we'll find that people will take more accountability when we see leadership take accountability. There's nothing worse than leaders who are never at fault ever for anything that ever goes wrong. Because again, it's setting up conditions that everybody has to be perfect all the time, which is impossible. And I'm not talking about negligence or something, but if there are performance issues, don't immediately assume that the person is the problem, but maybe they have a problem, especially if you have somebody who's been performing well over the course of time and all of a sudden things go sideways. Instead of starting yelling and berating them, to in private sit down with them and say, hey, everything okay? Performance has really been down. I'm worried about you. What's going on? You know, in other words, create a safe space for them to tell you what's happening. Maybe they're struggling at home. Maybe there's something else. Maybe we put them in a job they don't know how to do it. We can help them solve those problems. Rather than just screaming and yelling. You know, one of the hard thing that I think people forget about these things, which is, you know, leadership is a journey. It's not an event. And it's like being a parent. You'll never be an expert parent, just like you'll never be an expert leader. It just doesn't exist. It's a striving. And one of the things that I think is really important is leadership is a team sport. No one should ever attempt to be a leader alone. It's just too damn difficult. You should have trusted friends. It doesn't matter if they're the same rank as you. It doesn't matter if they're the same MOS as you, but relationships where you're constantly talking about it, comparing notes, talking about how you're doing. You should have a leadership buddy that you're constantly talking about this stuff with. Great leaders are students of leadership. They're constantly studying it. And so anybody who thinks they can do leadership alone, they're in for a big shock.
Okay. Thank you. Next question is going to come from Ryan Johnson, who asks, in Start With Why, you use the analogy of the carrot and the stick, saying they are byproducts of an organization defining itself by what it does, not why it exists. Based on your research and interviews, do you have a recommended path to convince our organizations and superiors to transition to a why definition rather than the what?
I think I understand the question. So I talk about that there's two ways to influence human behavior. You can manipulate it or inspire it. Manipulations include things like using fear to get people to do what we want, offering them potentials for bounty, you know, to get them to do what we want. You know, eat your vegetables, you'll get ice cream, and there's nothing, manipulations unto themselves are not necessarily bad. We do it all the time. We do it with our kids. We offer people bonuses or rewards to do things because those are the behaviors we want. The problem comes when we're only motivated by short-term goals and all we use is manipulations to achieve those short-term goals. Over the course of time, it destroys trust and cooperation. And so to use them in the context of something higher is better. And so the other one is to inspire behavior. And inspiring behavior means giving something for people to believe in. This is what it means to start with why. And it's the responsibility of every leader in every organization to explain why that organization exists. And to be honest, a lot of organizations are really bad at this. And it's not because they're bad people, it's because it's hard to do. As I said before, this is a biological problem where the part of the brain that controls the inspiration doesn't control language. And so we very often rationalize. We offer rational explanations for things we do rather than emotional connections. In the military, I hate to say it, but you go to any group and you ask them what their vision statement is, they're usually very, very rational. To be the best, to offer the highest quality X, it's all very rational. But the question is what inspires somebody to get out of bed every morning? So I do believe that leaders can do a better job of explaining why they do what they do. I mean, even the Army or West Point, when you say what's the reason we have an army? Why the Army? You say, defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. Okay, that's every one of the uniformed forces. Why did somebody choose to be in the Army? I want to serve my nation. Great, I got options for you. Why the Army? I wanted to be in the infantry. Okay, I still got options for you. Why the Army? And what if you don't want to be in the infantry? Like, why the Army, right? And each of the uniformed forces has a unique culture. The Marine Corps and the Army are very, very different organizations, even if they might do similar things at times, for example. And so the ideal is to find the organization where you belong. And unfortunately, some people pick wrong, based on their values and who they are. Somebody who might struggle as a soldier may do extremely well in one of the other forces, or somebody who's struggling in one of the other forces might thrive as a soldier. The question is, what are the values of the organization? What is the culture of the organization? And of course, even within that, there are subcultures. Where within the Army should I go? Where do I belong? And so part of articulating the why is helping people understand why they fit in the Army. And it should be something deeply, deeply, deeply emotional. You talk to any combatant commander, and when they're putting together their teams, they know, based on their own experience of decades in the forces, understand you want a soldier in this job, you want a Marine in that job, you want an airman in that job, you want a sailor in that job, because they understand how they approach the world and see problems differently. So the question is what's that magic sauce called soldier that the Army can communicate loudly and clearly so that people feel like they belong?
Okay. Our next question comes from Anonymous. You mentioned in your book the idea of the circle of safety, wherein people feel comfortable with those around them and feel protected from those outside. What should you do if you're unable to create the circle?
Okay, that's a loaded question. When you say you're unable to create the circle, I think what the person is asking, because it's anonymous, is not create it, but what if you don't feel like you're in one? So the reality is we will always work for leaders who are unable to do this. And so our responsibility is to be the leader we wish we had, which is we have to do the hard work of creating a circle of safety for our peers, and sometimes even those above us. Empathy can go up the chain of command. It doesn't just always go down. If somebody who's one level above us yells and screams at us on a regular basis, we can go into their office and say, hey boss, you've been really rough on us lately. Are you okay? I'm worried about you. Empathy can go up the chain of command. And empathy is assuming that somebody's not a bastard because they're screaming and yelling all the time, or they're not unable to create a circle of safety. Maybe they don't know how. Maybe they're insecure. Maybe they're scared. Maybe there's pressures on them that we don't understand. But our responsibility is to be the leader we wish we had. And yes, sometimes that means we take the brunt. Sometimes that means we take the hit. but we're protecting our team. And that's part of what it means to be a leader. We don't call you leader because you're higher up in the rank. We call you leader because you're willing to take the risk first, risk to run towards the danger first, risk to trust first, risk to take accountability first. That's why you earn the title of leader. Holding a leadership position, holding rank, doesn't make you a leader. Being a leader makes you a leader. And so if you're in a position where you do not operate on a circle of safety, that means everybody you work with also does not operate in a circle of safety, which means people hunker down and become individual and every person protect themselves, and then the team breaks down. And so the question is what can we do to be the leaders we wish we had, to create a team dynamic and make people feel safe? And what we'll start to see is change and people coming together. It's a very hard thing to do, but that's where you earn your stripes as a leader.
Okay. Next question comes from Robert Kenny, very short and to the point. What is the worst thing I can do on my first day as a new leader?
The worst thing you can do is pretend you know all the answers. The worst thing you can do is to start demanding people do as you say because you outrank them, when the reality is they know a lot more about the job than you do. Do not lean on your rank. Remember, I've never heard a great leader in my life ever say to their subordinates, prove to me why I should trust you. It's the opposite. It's the subordinates who say, prove to us why we should trust you. And so one of the best things you can do as a leader on day one is walk in and say, I'm new here. I don't know anything. My job is to clear a path for you guys to be the best you can do, to create a space in which you can all operate at your natural best. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to lean on you for help a lot, and I'm going to be in learning mode. And if you show up with that level of humility, in other words, to say something that everybody already knows, we already know you know nothing. So pretending you know everything is really not going to work out well.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Joshua Moore. Mr. Sinek, in your Inside Quest interview, you mentioned millennials have an issue with commitment to a career because of a disillusionment of the impact they have to the company or the world. My question is, from your exposure to the military, do lower enlisted or officers experience the same disillusionment, maybe leading to low reenlistment?
The simple answer is yes. The simple answer is yes. When I meet young officers or junior enlisted, the ones who came to the service wanting to serve and wanting to make an impact, those who came for a college education or because they wanted steady work, they may discover the honor of service while they're in and want to stay for longer. But some of them, not everybody comes in for that reason. But for those who come in who want to make an impact and want to make change and want to make a difference, sometimes the bureaucracy or the speed at which change can happen is mystifying. And they become disillusioned and they realize this is not what I wanted. And so yes, I do see the same, many of the same things. I don't think it's as intense as in private sector for a few reasons. One, you signed a contract. In private sector, junior people don't have contracts, so that's they can up and leave whenever they want. And I think that there's an inherent understanding that there's a progress through the rank system. But I think even the military is starting to question some of the practices in which it engages. Many of the systems in the military are left over from the 50s, from the 40s, and that just haven't been updated. I'll tell you one thing, and again, I've had conversations with senior military leaders where they're starting to question how can we take advantage of some of the really smart people at junior ranks who don't have a seat at the table. And that doesn't mean we're gonna make a 25-year-old a colonel. That's not what we're talking about. But if you have got a really smart 25, 26, 27-year-old with field experience who's seen things and done things that senior leaders who are overseeing the operation haven't done in years, how do we give those people a voice at the table? I think the military is starting to ask themselves those questions because we want to take advantage of that experience and that intelligence and those ideas. But yeah, no, it's true. I do see it in the military as well, which is why the military is asking itself these difficult questions, because it doesn't want to see young, smart talent leave. Questioning the up and out idea in the military as well. That if that you have to promote. There's some people who don't want to be leaders, but they're really, really good at their job and they don't want to leave their job. The question is, can we create a system in which somebody can stay and not be forced to promote, and especially if they're really, really good at their jobs? As an aside, the Air Force is complaining that they have a pilot shortage. Well, that's because they keep taking pilots out of the cockpits, to either ask them to leave the Air Force or to promote them if they don't want to be promoted. They just like flying. That's what I'm talking about. So I think there's opportunity here. I think the trend is not necessarily something we need to panic about, but I think it forces all the uniformed forces to take a hard look at themselves and say, are there little tweaks that we can make to our culture in order to keep our best and brightest in the system?
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Max Wiseman, who acts as a quick point of context for you. I'm sure you know, especially our junior leaders, they're going to come to a job, they're going to do a job for 12 months maybe before they move on to the next one. So with that in mind, how do we in the military as a whole play the infinite game when the system is so focused on short-term results?
So a couple things there. So the infinite game is not the absence of finite games. It's the context within which finite games exist. And so we have to constantly remind ourselves of that context. And so you're right. I mean, it might be easier to have a blended system where there's short-term assignments and long-term assignments, as just opposed to a series of short-term assignments. But the question is if you to maintain an infinite mindset means I'm going to make choices and decisions here that that may benefit the person who takes over after me. In other words, I may not get the credit, but it's the right thing to do. I'm creating cultural change or a new systemic change. That's the right thing to do for this group that makes this organization, that helps leave this organization in better shape than I found it. And to be okay with the fact that you may not get the credit. That's just how it works. Sometimes you will and sometimes you won't. Sometimes the results will happen in your tenure, and sometimes the results will only start to show up in the next person's tenure. And are you okay with that? Good leaders will know that that's happening and be able to recognize that you are making choices for the betterment of the organization if they don't show up immediately, especially if you're doing it over and over and over again. And so the pressure to simply show and demonstrate short-term results makes us make short-term decisions. And so maintaining an infinite mindset is understanding that each job you have is a stepping stone and that your responsibility is to make decisions that can outlast you.
Okay. Next question comes from Anonymous. What characteristics or traits do you think are the biggest indicators of a leader who will one day be a game changer?
That's a good question. I would say courage is number one. Courage is number one. We often hear like vision, charisma. I know a lot of great leaders who aren't like big Steve Jobs visionaries. I know a lot of leaders who don't have that traditional definition of charisma, which is a lot of energy and big personality, but courage is number one. The pressures on us are overwhelming to make short-term decisions. The pressures are overwhelming on us to put ourselves sometimes before the group. We talked about the promotion system sometimes accidentally forces us to celebrate ourselves. And so the courage to do the right thing, the courage to stay the course, the courage to act with integrity, especially when peer pressure is involved. These things are, the courage is overwhelming. I mean, the pressures are overwhelming sometimes. And that's why I talk about leadership being a team sport. I don't believe for 1 minute that anybody actually has the courage to do the right thing alone. If you think about it, a world famous trapeze artist would never try a brand new death-defying act without a net. The net provides that courage. The courage is external. And so that's why I talk about having a leadership buddy. If you are faced with an unbelievably difficult decision that is the right decision to make, but all the pressures are forcing you to go the other way, to be able to call someone and say, what do I do? I know this is the right thing to do, but I'm scared. Just to have somebody say, if this blows up in your face, I'll still be with you. For somebody to say, I got your back, or you got to do this, or it's the right thing to do. Just to have somebody who says, I got you, we'll go through this together, is the source of courage. It gives you tremendous courage. You ask anybody who's risked their life to save the life of another human being, why did you do it? You didn't have to, you weren't ordered to. In fact, sometimes they disobeyed an order to do so. They all give similar, if not the exact same answer, which is they would have done it for me. It's the belief that someone's got my back that gives me the courage to do difficult things. And so I think courage is number one, which is very closely related to integrity. Integrity matters, and I don't think you would need courage if you didn't have integrity.
This next question, I'm going to sort of modify the next anonymous question. When you started studying leadership a little over 10, 11 years ago, how, as you identified the ideal trait for a leader, has that changed over time, or did you always from the beginning saying it's courage, or did you sort of stumble into realizing that courage is the number one trait, followed closely by number two, integrity?
I've tweaked and refined and found nuance in my work, but if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said having a clear sense of why. But if you ask me now, I'd say, well, it takes courage to continue to do that. Yes, you have to have a clear sense of purpose cause. Yes, absolutely. But to never abandon that purpose cause and remain steadfast, that's where the courage comes in. So I think that I've built upon the opinions rather than change them. I think there's more depth and nuance to them these days.
Okay. Next question will be a little bit different. There's this, we've heard before that, living in a time of crisis is a great revealer, because it's when you're under pressure, you see things that you wouldn't normally see. So with that in mind, how would operating in a COVID environment today, how is that a good thing for us? I mean, obviously the tragedy of sickness and people dying is tragedy, yeah. But what's the goodness that comes out of living in this time of adversity?
Yeah. So, we cannot judge the quality of a crew by how the ship performs in calm waters. We judge the quality of a crew by how a ship performs in rough waters. And one of the amazing things that happened when crisis shows up is, in an instant, you can see who the functional teams are and who the dysfunctional teams are. In an instant, you can see who the functional leaders are and who the dysfunctional leaders are. It happens instantaneously, because all that trust that built up over the years where there was no COVID, all of a sudden when somebody's barking orders because we need to shift the organization and change, everybody's totally fine. Morale is high. Panic is what shows up in the dysfunctional organizations, where though there may be fear and uncertainty, there's a calm and a sense that we'll get through this together in the highly functional organizations. So, when you say what good came out of it, I think many of us learned a lesson. We learned, how do we perform in a moment of uncertainty? How do we perform under extreme pressure? I think one of the most important things is how do we handle our own trauma? When COVID showed up, and we all had to shift dramatically, sometimes big, sometimes small, I called a friend of mine who was active duty, and I asked him, when you're in combat, how do you compartmentalize your emotions? And he gave me a very stern warning. He said, we can't. He said, you can for a very short period of time, but nobody can compartmentalize their emotions over time. In other words, everybody's going to suffer the trauma of combat. You just may not suffer it in that moment. He said to me, when I come back from combat, he says, I don't suffer the trauma for 4 or 5 months after I get home. And everybody's fine and everybody's good and everybody thinks I should be fine. And all of a sudden, something's wrong. And so he gave me a very stern warning that no one avoids the trauma of crisis. No one. It's just a question of when you're going to deal with it and how you're going to deal with it. And sure enough, 4 or 5 months later into COVID, I was fully off my game and I didn't know what was going on. And I called up the same friend. I said, and I asked no leading questions. I said, what are your symptoms when you start to struggle? And he said, number one, he falls out of his sleep pattern, that he starts going to bed late for no reason and he doesn't want to get out of bed in the morning. And I was like, yep. And then he said, he has some unproductive days at work and he rationalizes, like, that's okay, I need a break. But then he has another and another. And I was like, yep. And he says he becomes really antisocial. He doesn't want to talk to people and he doesn't want to ask for help. And I was like, yep. And I realized I was suffering depression. And I was embarrassed by that term because it sounded like a diagnosis, so I didn't want to admit it. But the reality is that's what I was going through. And I think one of the things that crisis tests and as a leader is how will we struggle with our own trauma. And for somebody who lies, hides, and fakes, who pretends that everything's good every day as they struggle, that is a recipe for disaster. The stress will mount and the stress will become overwhelming to the point that it becomes too much to handle for one person. And so to have the courage to say out loud, I'm going through it. I'm struggling, and I'm going to need some help. Even if it's I just need to talk to somebody. Especially if we're in a command situation where we tell our people that they need to seek help if they're struggling, but we never need help. Then what we're doing is we're lying to our people. That's saying it'll make them feel weak if we never need help, but we're telling them that they do. And so it's a big deal for somebody in a leadership position to say, you know, I've been off my game this week. I'm going to go talk to the counselor today, and do that out loud. To say that out loud gives other people permission and courage to do the same. And I think that was one of the huge revealers, which is you will suffer trauma. How will you handle it? And what kind of example will you set for your people?
Okay, thank you. I think we're down to our last few minutes. I'm going to have one question to see if we can do it quickly. It's how can you tell if ethical fading is happening in your organization? Because I'm sure it just doesn't. It's not overnight. Is there any indicators that they're slipping that way?
Yeah, it's a slippery slope. I mean, that's one of the conditions, which is, you know, it happens once, then it happens 3 times, then it happens 5 times. You know, if you look for the warning signs, like I said, excessive pressure to make short-term results at the expense of long-term integrity, overuse of euphemisms, the slippery slope, one person does it, 5 people do it, the massive amount of rationalizing. Look, everyone's doing it. You know, it doesn't cause any harm. Who cares? Just it's the system. It's not our fault. It's what the boss wants. Like, for somebody to be able to stand up and say something's wrong here. I mean, I think the funny thing is most people know that the decisions they're making are unethical. The question is whether we believe we're unethical. We blame the organization. We blame our bosses. We blame the system. And personal accountability is a big part. So it takes one person to say, I've been a part of this, and we can't do this anymore. This is wrong. That's leadership. It's the courage to speak out and sometimes speak truth to power in a productive and constructive manner.
Okay. Well, Simon, I think we're about to hit up on our end time. So again, I thank you again for your time. It's been a great discussion. And I want to thank you for chewing up my entire Sunday watching all your talks. I just got myself into a marathon binge session, so I learned a lot. So with that, thanks again for your time. We do appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Hopefully next time in person.
Roger. Sounds good.